This is a discourse based on a couple of papers. Actually, there are many papers in this direction of how politics, populism, nationalism, and the urgency of climate action, climate change, and the narratives that all come together in very strange ways. So there is this new terminology called climate nationalism, and what does that mean, and whether that's really a good thing or a bad thing. Nationalism in general tends to raise flags because it can be ethnic, so it can be about discriminating against some group, some religion, some minority based on whatever logic. There could be cultural nationalism, but then there are also things like resource nationalism, where you want to protect your resources, whether it's precious metals, oil, gas, and so on, or you want to build securitization around it, in the sense you want to protect your interests in the context of some conflict. Could be water resource, for example. And there is, of course, now new things like green nationalism and climate nationalism. So green nationalism is, of course, trying to say a country can combine politics with environmental friendly actions, policies, livelihoods, lives, lifestyles, and so on, to favor green actions and green nationalism, whereas climate nationalism is a bit more complicated and kind of wraps around all of these ideas. So as we go along, we will see what we mean by that and how it's playing out. Already you know what it means, because each country is participating in the UNFCCC Paris Agreement, the whole negotiation that goes on each year, conference of parties, and so on. And then the idea is that each nation has its own climate approach to climate action, mitigation, adaptation, and then each country has its own interests. Could be climate adaptation, mitigation, but also climate resilience. Could be climate securitization in terms of protecting itself from sea level rise, from extreme events, from food security issues, energy, water security issues, and so on and so forth. So everything comes together, and in the last decade or so there's been this rise in populism, especially from Trump, and then there are others like Bolsonaro. Some people count Modi under it, and then there are people in charge of Russia and China, Xi Jinping and Putin, and so on and so forth. When it then translates into climate, you have right and left. So there are people who are very fanatic and very extreme. Some people call them eco-fascists. So eco-fascism even argues that things like HIV and pandemic are good because it kills off human beings, and that saves the environment, is better for the planet, and so on. So in general, fascism is right-wing in the politics, but in climate, eco-fascism, which by some measure could be worrying extremely about environmentalism, actually also falls into right-wing approach to environment. So can nationalization be good or bad? Is there something like a civic nationalism as opposed to ethnic or xenophobic nationalism in terms of worrying within the national boundaries about equity, justice, and whatever climate adaptation, mitigation actions are taken, that they will be just and equitable as well, inclusive as well, and so on and so forth. But there are rhetorics associated around those as well that translate to immigrants. Trump went after immigrants in many forms. Le Pen from France said migrants are not ecologists because they don't care about the ecology of where they live. They just go, they're nomads, and they go wherever they want, wherever there is opportunities. Obviously those are kind of populisms. Populism in general is about exploiting the disenfranchisement, the sense of disenfranchisement and lack of access to information, power, government, justice, and so on by the one group of people who are not rich and cannot have control on things. So they have their own concerns, they have their own feeling that they have been neglected and so on. So somebody like Trump or Bolsonaro can come along and exploit those feelings and keep talking about ideas that are popular among certain groups and then get elected. So these things can happen within democracy itself, but then you argue that that's not a good thing. And then you have Greta Thunberg, who is also a populist on climate, and nobody would be happy if you talk about Trump and Greta Thunberg in the same breath, but both are populists. They use issues to talk about truth. They are seen as the speakers of the truth by the groups they see them as their heroes. So you have to just be aware that populism can go both ways. And there are ideas that are going after the way UN Security Council and the general UN negotiations on climate change goes, that the UN Security Council, using its veto power and so on, is pushing for so-called climate securitization, protecting ourselves against climate change. But is that focused much more on national interests that are being portrayed as climate action and climate securitization? So those are things that are also being debated. The paper that I took from The Wire says the specific logic of securitization that industrially advanced countries use implies a particular way of mitigating threats and managing risk that inevitably prioritizes the resilience of the system, that is, business as usual, ahead of other human and environmental security concerns. This is from Hayes 2016, quoted in this paper that I'm using. What does this mean? Basically, resilience is, of course, the ability to recover from a perturbation or a shock. And when you say climate resilient, do we really mean that we want to continue our lifestyle as is and somehow manage climate change by all these ideas about net zero and negative emissions and reducing emissions and so on and so forth? Even the New Green Deal idea by Tom Friedman, I think it's Friedman from New York Times, argues that the lifestyle of America with all the dependence on cars is somehow not really something that needs to be gotten rid of or has to be gotten rid of, while managing to find energy in a carbon-free way. So this idea of changing the system and decarbonizing and so on are all kind of playing into this nationalism, and whether the nationalism, so if each country has a climate nationalism and does its own thing to make itself resilient to climate change, does that add up to global climate resilience? It's not so obvious. So there is no one definition of nationalism, and there is nothing like good and bad. So the paper concludes, as we will see in the end, that this is complicated and it has to be looked at more carefully in terms of how nationalism and climate nationalism actually affect climate action. So populism is now considered a crisis of similar magnitude as climate change. Some people call it climate crisis. Some people are not so happy with that terminology. The general idea that the climate change is already here and we're already too late to save ourselves, and there is only so much room left to save ourselves, so many years left, and so on and so forth, all are kind of similar to populism, and many climate scientists willingly or unwillingly participate in this messaging, alarmist messaging of climate change being the end of the world kind of thing. The other thing that's mentioned here is to look at the ideas coming from Trump and Thunberg in terms of the tropes they use for climate change and how they would deal with it. Trump, of course, wanted to seal off the borders, make US energy secure by using whatever means like coal, and drill for more oil and gas and so on and so forth. So he said in 2017, for example, under the agreement, he's talking about Paris Agreement, China will be able to increase these emissions emissions by a staggering number of years, 13. They can do whatever they want for 13 years, not us. India makes its participation contingent on receiving billions and billions and billions of dollars in foreign aid from developed countries. So the negotiated parts of how carbon budget works, how global warming targets work, how within that there is this common but differentiated responsibilities are dealt with in allowing China and India and other global south countries to catch up, because historically accumulated carbon has come from the developed world and so on. That's used by Trump in this way to put nationalism, climate nationalism, as a way to do climate securitization. So that's obviously one example. The other example, of course, is from Greta Thunberg. The new equilibrium that follows this disruption is arguably the least clearly articulated aspect of Thunberg's narrative. The new equilibrium that follows this disruption. Okay, while she is very clear on the need for aggressive and immediate reduction in carbon emissions and consumption habits, she remains quite ambiguous in terms of what this might mean. Obviously, she is being given information and she has a lot of emotions, as you remember the 2015 speech where she was really angry and was literally screaming, saying, "How dare you," and so on, which didn't play out well with even most of the climate scientists who support climate action and so on, and others from other spheres of society who also believe in climate change. So in the Western Hemisphere, in the North Atlantic, there may be climate denialism, which is playing into climate nationalism. And Greta Thunberg is, on the other hand, confused on some front here. For example, she said in 2020, let's be clear, we don't need a low carbon economy. We don't need lower emissions. Our emissions have to stop if we are to have a chance to stay below the 1.5 degrees target. That's the global warming target by 2100 with a 67% probability. She went on, and until we have the technologies that at scale can put our emissions to minus, then we must forget about net zero. We need real zero. So obviously this is quite confused, because net zero and real zero do not mean we have zero carbon. There are irreducible emissions, so there will be negative emissions technology, so we will take out more carbon than we emit. So those kinds of details can get confused when Greta Thunberg is pushing hard on all these things. So she's also a star who is seen as the speaker of the truth by one group, Fridays for the Future and so on, young people. We're not debating about whether she's doing something wrong or right. We're just saying populism is what is being used by people like Trump and Bolsonaro, and also by Thunberg. So we have to be aware of that. So this paper also points out how populist narratives work, the narrative frame and the role of the storyteller in populism. So you have characters, plot lines, what is the equilibrium of the story, change happens, what disrupts equilibrium A and creates change, and in equilibrium B, what is the next last equilibrium of the plot. So populist narrative frame and the unmasking of the role of the truth teller. I'm digressing a little bit, but I want to just kind of briefly visit it just to see how climate populism is being assessed, evaluated, analyzed, pitting a protagonist and antagonist against each other. For example, people versus elite, individual versus institutions, local versus global, young versus old. This is all playing out in both Trump and Thunberg, for example. Unmasking the role of the truth teller. The truth teller exposes the antagonists as corrupt and undeserving of respect or trust. Very common. In the plot lines, the populist narrative frame gives us the interests of the protagonists are compared with the current situation, which is understood as a crisis, like climate change, or what Trump portrayed as the degradation of America, so make America great again kind of narrative. The solution to the crisis is simple and can be achieved through black and white answers. Trump was always full of black and white answers. The protagonists achieve sovereignty and challenge the antagonist's betrayal. Trump was ridiculing pretty much everybody in that sense. In terms of unmasking the role of the truth teller exposes the betrayal of the protagonists by the antagonists and the terrible way this will end unless change is realized. So Trump basically said, if you don't elect me, this is going to be disaster. The truth teller shows how they have the keys to finding a path to success. So this also works in the Thunberg case, where if climate action is not taken immediately and urgently with real zero and not net zero and so on, that's also the populism approach. The truth teller depicts a utopian future that's only possible through the path they have charted and by challenging the antagonists. I don't want to dwell on it too much. So applying the populist narrative frame in the climate change storytelling of Trump and Thunberg. This is a lot of text. I'm not going to read all of it, but let's just read the top ones for characters, Trump and Thunberg. China is crippling US competitive edge in an unfair way. Liberal media, fake news, exaggerate climate change in order to regulate more. US industry suffers under the red tape of climate change mitigation. To save jobs and the economy, the US has to leave the Paris Agreement. The UN is biased against the US and needs to be rolled back. Okay, very populist speech that in fact worked. Thunberg, on the other hand, corporate elite are destroying the planet for profits and to give rich people a better lifestyle. Politicians and media let this exploitation happen without acting and are therefore responsible. The adults are responsible through lifestyles and everyday life consumption. They must make choices in the name of youth and a future generation that cannot vote. The youth, future generations, ecosystems and other victims are hailed as the true people who will rise up against the system demanding a revolution. Okay, so obviously the plot lines involved go along the line of an imagined past when America was great and the country could exploit fossil resources without concern for the environmental protection and climate change. And in Thunberg's case, it is the story of a disaster that's happening, and the writing is on the wall. Global elites ignore the facts that climate change is creating a disaster that will sacrifice future generations, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you get the idea. So here the article therefore concludes that despite highly contrasting approaches, both Trump and Thunberg in fact practice similar forms of populist storytelling that rely on acts of truth-telling by the hero, applying the same populist narrative frame. This is a damning conclusion. Populism and climate change therefore have a varied relationship that extends far beyond climate change denialism, and our findings suggest that populist storytelling, by connecting emotions and affect with highly complex policy problems, has more to do with our political engagement with climate change than we might have otherwise assumed. So obviously climate scientists also have to look in the mirror and to see how they are maybe falling into the trap of always making quick judgments on everything being created by climate change, for example. This is a tough issue, of course, but where do we stop being climate scientists and start being advocates, and where does our advocacy fall into this trap of populism, for example? Okay, coming back to the first paper, some points they are making. Despite the dominant focus on right-wing nationalism as the main purveyor of a dangerous form of populism, recent scholarship on resource nationalism and climate movements indicate that populist politics is not the exclusive domain of right-wing authoritarianism. Instead, progressive climate scientists and scholars seek to use the emotional and bonding power of nationalism to promote meaningful climate action. Essentially, there is some end justifies the means approach being taken, which has to be carefully assessed to see if climate scientists stand to lose credibility by going in that direction. Three major problems in the narratives of civic nationalism. The nation state may not be the most appropriate unit of climate action for a variety of reasons. This is obvious. It's a global problem. The different sizes of nation states and the historical trajectories of emissions may motivate nationalist leaders to argue against incurring the cost of climate action. Secondly, the assumption that a line can be drawn between the positive and destructive forms of nationalism, which includes the claim that the nation comes first, for example, America first or European homeland. And three, even if a narrative of green nationalism can be woven together, the proponents of civic nationalism cannot always control such discourses easily or avert unintended consequences. Okay, so just keep the points in mind and read more to see how you perceive your own ideas on climate action, climate nationalism, and whether populism can exploit climate change either way. Okay. Even stronger critiques describe civic nationalism as an oxymoron or the illusion of a nationless nationalism. Some scholars have sought to address these critiques while emphasizing the relevance of civic nationalism in addressing the climate crisis. So obviously there are people on both sides. Looking at this in the context of Asian players gives a stark contrast to the way nationalism plays out in North America and Europe versus Asia, even though Australia is a global north rich country, one of the high emitters in terms of per capita, even though total emission is not that high because the population is small. What is the way in which climate nationalism playing out in Australia? Just the conclusion. There are examples given on how various prime ministers have played it. Overall, Australian leaders remain focused on market-led technological responses to climate change as a uniquely Australian project which relies on the power of persuasion instead of climate denialism. The narratives that valorize the combined power of technology and capitalism seem to crowd out the need for promoting a progressive civic nationalism. These strategies illustrate the extent to which politicians can depoliticize the issues surrounding ecological degradation and climate change on the pretext of defending national interests. So you say, yes, climate change is happening and we must do something, we must increase climate resilience and so on, and then we say we will do it in the context of technology and market forces, and then you try to massage the two together. So it's a complicated way of doing climate nationalism. On the Indian side, of course, PM Modi has been a big player on the international stage, starting things like Solar Alliance and industrial transitions, asserting his leadership on climate action within the country, investing on renewables, allowing private players to come in. But it's more complicated than that. Overall, the Indian case highlights an interesting combination of cultural nationalism, climate nationalism, and populism, none of which is used to question the anthropogenic climate change. So as opposed to some parts of North America and Europe, climate denialism is not a problem in China and India. Nobody questions that it's caused by anthropogenic climate change. Of course, if they do that, then they cannot also blame the rich world and ask for funding, for example. This makes sense given that the majority of India's population faces extreme vulnerability to the rapidly increasing instances of droughts, floods, and heat waves. Yet, India's climate nationalism is also tied to vociferous advocacy in favor of fixing the responsibility of highly industrialized countries to lead on and pay for global climate action. This is what Trump was harping on. So India, during negotiations, wants the rich world, the developed countries, and the global north to own up, and tools like loss and damage are very critical for India, and the NDCs are nationally determined contributions. Some are not dependent on external aid, but some are contingent on availability of climate funds, for example. China has similar approach, but it has slightly nuanced difference in terms of asserting China's nationalism and its global ambitions, and internally it accepts climate change as an issue and has invested much more than any country in the world in renewables, for example. President Xi Jinping remarked that the pursuit of an era of ecological civilization and the construction of a beautiful China is the key content of the Chinese dream of a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So climate action and climate change response are being wrapped into this glorious return of Chinese nation and rejuvenation of a great culture. Both India and China emphasize how they have historically been worshippers of the of nature, sun, ecology, and forests, and so on and so forth. Okay. Finally, the conclusion, the suggestion this paper offers from the Wire. Instead of starting with the question of whether nationalistic discourses and nationalist politics may help or hinder climate action, researchers might want to ask what are the various ways in which political and economic elites fuse discourses of nationalism with various aspects of climate politics and climate action. A proper understanding of elite interests, discourses, and strategies in ways that account for varied national and regional political and economic contexts, we argue, is crucial for a fuller appreciation of the effects of nationalism on climate action. So this, of course, also applies in general for climate scientists in terms of climate communication. It's very common now for climate scientists to talk to the media and make statements about climate change and call it communication and call their actions as climate actions and puts value on them as to how they may save lives and so on. So this is not a criticism of any of that. This is a way of saying we have to watch out for the boundaries between science, advocacy, and populism framework for being the truth teller, especially when people take your word and look at climate change narratives uncritically in many instances. And unfortunately, people who take climate change as a serious crisis that we are facing doesn't necessarily lead to climate action, or it can be wait and see attitude as well, or it can be just helplessness and anxiety about the future, etc. All these things have to be worried about, but the bigger idea of climate nationalism is something we have to really watch out for in terms of how it may all add up to action at the global level and how that may play into the goals of decarbonization and global warming targets, etc. Okay.